Welcome to BizTech's Investor Conversation Show. Now, our guest today is Gautam Godwani. He's the Managing Director of Good Startup. Good Startup is a venture firm focused on the alternative protein sector. Now, the company invests in entrepreneurs creating the next generation of food and materials companies. Now, to tell us more, Gautam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, pleased to be here.
Now, Gautam, you're a very successful entrepreneur in your past life. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you started Good Startup.
I've spent most of my life in Silicon Valley. My career, as you mentioned, was spent building two companies, and both have been acquired now. The last acquisition was in 2016. And I was very excited about doing something where I could have a positive impact on the planet in whatever small way that I could. So I started looking at the sustainability area initially very broadly. But as I did further research, I came across the area of animal agriculture and just realized that there was an extremely broad set of implications coming out of the sector that spanned everything from resource usage on our planet to human health, to climate change, to animal welfare implications. And as a result of that, I really felt very compelled to see what I could do to help come up with alternatives, because obviously these are foods that so many of us have grown up eating, and we need alternatives that allow us to continue to get the nutrition that we need, but really have sustainable practices for the planet as well. So alternative proteins seemed like a good part of the answer to me, because you're really producing the same foods using plants or microbes or growing animal cells in a lab, and then providing them to consumers so that they can eat the foods they like, get the nutrition they need, but also be able to be more friendly to the planet.
Now, Gautam, could you give us a primer on the alternative protein space?
Sure. The exciting thing about the alternative protein sector is that there are multiple technologies at play. So plant-based foods, which is what everyone has heard about, is by far the most advanced. This is where you have the Beyond Meat burger, which is made from pea protein. And the idea is to use different plant sources to construct really the same types of meat products that folks are used to eating, or dairy or seafood or eggs. In addition to that, you have microorganism-based products. This is also known as fermentation. So this is where you're using materials like mycelium, which is the rootstock of mushrooms, or microalgae or yeast to produce proteins. And all of these microbes are very, very efficient at being able to produce a whole host of proteins, the same ones that we see in meat. And then finally, you can take animal cells and grow them outside the lab. And these are cell-based or cultivated technologies. So you have plant-based, microorganism-based or fermentation, and cell-based or cultivated. And all of these technologies are at work. And each of them have their advantages and disadvantages. So when you end up taking these technologies and creating products from them, you can even create hybrid products. So imagine a product where plants are bringing the nutrition. Microbes are being used to precision engineer proteins that are in meat and now available for use in these products. And then you get the taste and texture that you get from animal cells or animal products being grown in a lab. And you put those together and you get this hybrid product that tastes just like meat, but it has much better nutrition.
To give the audience a perspective on efficiency and how much better this is for the environment, Beyond Meat makes a claim that their burger makes use of 99% less water and 93% less land, and generates 90% less emissions when compared to a regular beef burger. So we're really talking about significantly lighter carbon footprint in the production of each of these proteins.
Precisely correct. So depending on the technology you use and the method you use, the numbers vary slightly. But at a broad level, you're talking about 90% less energy usage and 99% less water and less land usage. Those are pretty incredible numbers. And so I think you can put together a set of products and be able to just do them in a much more sustainable way. Now, the reason that this happens is because we don't end up just growing foods and eating them. We grow different foods, we feed them to animals, and then we eat those animals. And so depending on the kind of meat or seafood that you're eating, you might have as little as a 9-to-1 ratio, meaning 9 calories into the animal to 1 calorie out for us, to up to 27 calories in for the animal and 1 calorie out to us. So when you're spending 9 to 27 calories for every 1 calorie we eat, things get out of hand pretty quickly. And this is the reason that we use about 83% of our farmland only to produce about 18% of our calories. Now, that's a huge problem. But if you can take alternative proteins and have a calorie ratio of closer to 3-to-1, which again varies based on your method and the kind of food you're producing, that is a dramatic implication for the planet and for our resource usage. And that's really what's going on with alternative proteins. You're taking this calorie ratio of 9 to 27 to 1 and bringing it down to 3-to-1 or lower.
Now, Gautam, one of the key things that worries a lot of consumers who are not familiar with this alternatives is the safety aspects of engineered food. Could you highlight the benefits and perhaps some of the disadvantages of some of these alternatives?
Yes, I think it's important for all of us to recognize collectively that we have a long way to go and that we are going to get better and better every year. When you take a look at the products that most of us eat today, short of the natural products that we buy and eat them in their pure form, like an apple, when you take any kind of processed food, consumers are used to going and looking at the back of the label and seeing a whole host of ingredients that they don't recognize. So these processed foods are a part of our world. Foods have been engineered for a long, long time, and we have agencies that are very good at assessing the safety of these products, and then before they go out to consumers. These same agencies like the FDA and the SFA are now at play to look at the safety of these products. And you already see that Singapore has approved cultivated meat in limited use cases. For example, that's being made by Good Meat, where you can consume this and it's safe. I have consumed this and I can tell you that I'm still here and things are fine. So of course we are very, very early, but I think we have to recognize that these foods are being produced in methods that are well understood, transparent, and that these companies are working hand in hand with regulatory agencies to ensure that they are safe for consumption. And in the limited use cases that we see globally today, we are seeing people consume these products, and we haven't seen any issues come out of it to date.
One thing I have to stress, obviously, because some clinical studies have shown that alternative proteins basically help to lower chronic diseases and mortality rates. Now, not enough study has been done, but obviously because it is plant-based, the trends are, and I suppose the industry is pushing those sort of outcomes as success stories in terms of plant-based consumption. But Gautam, I want to talk you just mentioned Singapore. I want to talk to you about Singapore and the fact that you're based in Singapore, but you've come out of from the Valley to set this up. Singapore is the only country in the world, as you mentioned, that has approved commercial sale of cultivated or lab-grown meat. How is Singapore trying to establish itself as a hub for alternative protein?
The Singapore government, I think, has done an incredible job to position itself as a leader in the sector globally. In Asia, Singapore now is really the gateway for the sector. And I think what the government has been doing is luring startups such as Good Meat to come in and establish facilities and giving them a regulatory pathway to be able to advance their objectives. But Singapore has also attracted larger companies like Givaudan and Buehler to come and establish operations here and to be able to engage overall with the ecosystem, not just in Singapore, but in Asia. So I think it's important that Singapore continue to provide these incentives because if these incentives continue, then these companies establish operations and that talent comes in, whether it's indigenous talent in Singapore that is trained and then moves forward and has then the wherewithal to create new organizations, or it's talent that is coming in and working here in the sector and then bringing those skills to the local talent here. But over time, as that talent base builds, the sector then expands. And so I think that if the government can continue to provide a very friendly environment for these companies, whether they're startups or incumbents, to come in, establish operations, build the talent base, that is ultimately then what brings in investment, creates infrastructure, and creates a very, very healthy ecosystem over time.
Now, Gautam, I want to then zoom in now on the Good Startup itself as a fund. Now, you've raised two funds. You raised a $25 million fund last year. And you also just raised an additional $34 million for your Good Protein Fund 1. Tell us about these fundraisers and how you've deployed the capital so far.
Yeah, so these collectively are one pool with the total base of 34 million. Our first close was at 25, our second close at 34. Now, the amazing thing about this collective base of capital is that we're using it to not just invest in Asia, but we're actually investing in companies globally. Companies that we invest in love the fact that we are based in Singapore. If it's an Asian company, then this is a local fund that is investing in them, and we're very excited about that. And the reason behind that excitement is that by 2025, Asia will be the largest market for alternative proteins, and Singapore is the gateway to the sector in Asia. So we feel great about being a fund that can invest in those Asian companies. But when we invest in global companies, these companies are very motivated to come to Asia because the size of the market here isn't the only attraction. It's the fact that companies look to Asia to bolster their supply chain, to get to do additional R&D, to set up manufacturing operations. So in addition to distribution, there's a whole host of other reasons to come to Asia. And so we're excited about the fact that we don't just invest in local companies, but we help global companies come to Asia as well.
Now, Gautam, you've invested in about 21 companies, if I'm not mistaken, both, as you said, Asia, APAC, and globally. Tell us about some of the companies you've invested in so far, and what's your typical ticket size per investment?
So that is absolutely correct. We've now invested in over 20 companies. Our initial check size is $500,000 to $1 million US. We're very, very excited about companies that are locally in the Singaporean and Asian ecosystem, companies such as Turtle Tree Labs that are working on really high value ingredients, as well as categories like human breast milk. Avant Meats that is working, for example, to create cultivated fish. And so it's really a seafood startup and is creating a whole set of seafood related products. But we also invest across a number of different areas. So we invest in substitutes for meat, seafood, dairy, and eggs, as well as materials that come from animals. So materials like leather, wool, and silk. And so we have an investment in a company called Vitro Labs in the United States that is creating cultivated leather. They're growing animal cells to make leather. I have felt and smelled this leather, and it's incredible.
But that's going to be an incredible disruptor if that really takes off in a large scale.
In a number of ways. Not only is it more sustainable, but the tanning process, for example, is very, very chemically driven. And so there's opportunities to create something that is a very, very good product, but at the same time, much more sustainable. So what's exciting about the sector is that when things started out in alternative proteins, you heard about the Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, or Oatly. So we were really talking about ground meat, and we were talking about plant-based milks. Now what you're seeing is a whole array of startups across meats, doing whole cuts, doing different types of meats, whether it's lamb and other types of meats. You're seeing a whole host of seafood startups now come out. You're seeing other innovative ways of creating dairy and also egg substitutes. You're seeing new categories of dairy, such as yogurt and cheese. And of course, with materials, a whole host of startups working on leather and wool and silk. So it's that diversity that is really compelling. And at the same time, the supply chain underneath all of this, which is what's enabling these great products, is getting more advanced also, which will enable wonderful products of tomorrow.
Now, Gautam, what are some of the key trends that you're now seeing in the protein alternative space that particularly in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. So I think a number of interesting trends in the sector to be aware of. We are just in the first chapter. What we have seen is a shadow of what we will see in the next 5 to 10 years. My background is in technology. So I started my first company literally in the first 3 to 4 years after the internet was popularized in the mid 1990s. And so this is to me the 1995 moment for alternative proteins that it was for the internet back then. And here we are nearly 30 years later. At that time in the internet, Google hadn't been invented, Facebook hadn't been invented, Amazon Web Services hadn't been invented, Airbnb hadn't been invented. None of these services were around at that time. And people were dialing into the internet with their phones at home. And so it was a radically different time, and we forget how much things have changed in a relatively short time. So as we look forward, we today see alternative proteins at a premium price. We will reach price parity. We today just see ground meat and milk, but we will see whole cuts and seafood and new categories of products. We will see taste and texture that not only mimics meat, but is different and even better. If you can imagine something abstract, imagine that you taste something that tastes meatier than meat. You say, wow, this is meat, but it tastes even better. How can that be? Imagine that you have products with better health profiles. So you eat a particular product, say you eat some meat or seafood, but it has less saturated fat and less cholesterol, but tastes the same. And it has no contaminants. So in the case of seafood, it doesn't have mercury or microplastics. In the case of meat, it's free of antibiotics, but it tastes the same. And that's pretty incredible to see. And that's what's coming.
Now, Gautam, I want to zoom in on you now. You're now an investor, but you've been an entrepreneur with 2 successful exits. Tell us about some of the lessons that you learned doing those 2 exits. The first one was, I think, an exit to AOL, and the second one was your startup, Simply Hired. Tell us about the lessons that you learned from the sale of those 2 companies.
The startup process to me is just incredible. I have found it very rewarding, in particular because of 2 aspects. One, I love the process of seeing something come out of nothing. You create something new, and I find that very rewarding. And secondly, from a personal standpoint, it is the steepest learning curve that I have ever been on. And that is why I was so fascinated to be involved in these companies. The startup process begins because an entrepreneur is very passionate about creating something, and you need that passion to be the driver, because the startup process itself is incredibly difficult. There are ups and downs at every stretch, and when you go up and you come back down, the only thing that will save you in that downturn is remembering why you did what you did and that compelling reason behind it. So I think that we invest in companies that have great technology, and these companies then take this technology and they bring it to market. And so I think that if you're starting a company, you have to look very closely at why it is that when there's a whole array of products that are out there, why a particular consumer would choose your product. And you have to be able to articulate a reason why you are going to go to market and a consumer will choose that product over all of the other products out there. That basic capacity of saying, here's what I'm building and here's what I'm selling is where the journey begins. But when you get to the fundraising process, that is the time when you have to convince investors like myself to say that, okay, this is a particular product that I have, and I'm going to get to this specific milestone, and this specific milestone will allow me to raise even more money that will then allow me to go to the next step of the process. So you have to have that kind of focus to be able to segment the journey into those specific steps so that you can raise capital along the way and build the startup milestone by milestone.
Gautam, it's been a fascinating conversation. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I think that when you look at the alternative protein sector as a whole, I can imagine that there is skepticism about the fact that things are so early and they're unfamiliar. But we have to remember that along the way, technology has these changes that come that seem very unfamiliar in the beginning, but over time they become very familiar. And I'll just leave you with one vignette. There used to be a time when we needed ice, we would literally truck it down from the mountains. And that's how we would get ice. Refrigerators were then invented. And when ice came out of those refrigerators, we used to call that artificial ice. Can you imagine that you get ice out of a refrigerator today and you call that artificial ice today? So this name that we have, alternative proteins, that alternative is in there only because it's new. And as human beings, we have a long history of things being new and then not being so new anymore and having them be a part of our lives. So that's what I think we'll see with alternative proteins. One day they'll just be called proteins.
That's a great takeaway. Gautam, thank you very much for taking your time to speak to us.
My pleasure.
Now, we've been speaking to Gautam Godwani, the managing partner at Good Startup. I'm Brian Fernandez, and this has been BizTech's Investor Conversation Show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our social media platforms. It will also be on our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks for tuning in.